In 2016, the full federal court overturned the Sharma versus Minister for the Environment case, and in doing so found that under the EPBC Act, the minister has no duty of care or duty to consider climate change impacts in the decisions the minister takes. Such a matter, the court said, is for the parliament. So here we are, with the opportunity to improve our environmental laws, and with respect, the minister is not doing that. It is so important that the nature positive reforms must, as a matter of urgency, recognise the impact of global warming on the environment. The minister says further tranches of reform are coming and will implement interim are coming and will address shortcomings of the legislation then. But with respect, as decisions continue to be made, we at the very minimum need to implement interim measures to take into account and implement better protections. The case in point is only 2 days ago, the ministers recently approved the Gina Rinehart's Atlas gas project out to the year 2080, which puts at risk koala habitat and will exacerbate the climate crisis, and it will in turn further destroy the environment that she is tasked to protect. The minister is adamant that the impact of emissions from gas approval projects that go through her office will be dealt with or are dealt with by the safeguard mechanism. But at the same time, the government is on notice that those very mechanisms are flawed, because as facilities are not properly measuring and monitoring methane emissions from gas extraction, and they are not properly reporting it. Therefore, they are not properly offsetting the emissions, the full impact of their emissions, through the safeguard mechanism. Every new project approved by this minister and the next ministers is doing significantly more damage to the environment via the emissions of those projects than the government is acknowledging and accounting for. Without including provisions for this law to take into account the impact of climate change, the impact of emissions on the environment, this minister and future ministers for the environment will continue to ignore the biggest threat to nature, global warming. In question time, we've seen the government ask itself a number of Dorothy Dixes regarding its environmental credentials, trying to greenwash over its repeated approvals of more coal and gas. There's a disconnect. Over the last 2 centuries, Australia has suffered the largest recorded degeneration in biodiversity across the globe. And of course, the climate crisis sits alongside this biodiversity crisis. Sadly, it is the Labor government and coalition who have now again refused to support the introduction of a duty of care to future generations in legislation, as proposed by Senator Pocock, and those very students that were overturned in relation to the earlier case. And I note we have students in the gallery here watching this process of decision-making, and they should be aware the major parties, Labor and the Coalition, are refusing to implement into legislation a duty of care to their generation and future generations. That is important, especially while we are in the midst of an extinction crisis. The numbers are simply appalling. Approximately 3 billion mammals, birds, reptiles, fish and frogs were killed or displaced in the Black Summer fires. 7 mass coral bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef, including one occurring right now, not that you would know from the amount of attention it has gotten from the government or the media, totalling 5 in the last 7 years. It simply cannot recover when it happens consecutively that way. Multiple major fish kills in the Murray Darling Basin and deaths of large numbers of flying foxes and cockatoos in the very hot weather. These animals are important forest pollinators and scene dispersers. You are kidding yourself if you think that this happens aside to agriculture, to the economies of communities. All of this is interlinked. Australia's environment protection laws are failing. It's not only a huge issue for Australia, but also represents a failing when it comes to our national and international commitments. We have committed with other governments from around the world to a 30 by 30 target to protect at least 30% of Australia's lands and oceans by 2030. Last year, the government announced 0 extinctions targets for the country's plants and animals. and we've signed the Glasgow's Leaders' Declaration on Forest and Land Use Pledge. To achieve this, we need wholesale reform, including strong national standards, an independent cop on the beat when it comes to the environment, and with meaningful power and a way to take into account for climate change impacts on the environment to ensure we will continue to have an environment that we can protect. So look, like many Australians, I was positive to hear this government promise at the last election that they would bring in nature-positive reforms. But where are they? Over 2 years in, we have tinkered around the edges, but we have not moved the dial when it comes to protecting the environment. A water trigger, we introduced a water trigger late last year into the legislation, into the EBBC, under pressure from the crossbench, but the minister is refusing to use it in respect to projects like the Beetaloo Basin gas. So, unfortunately, these bills before us again today do little to strengthen standards and actually ensure better protection. The genesis of these reforms lies in the Samuels Review of the EPBC Act. That report was finished in 2020 and the Morrison government just sat on it. It then tried to introduce and actually rammed through this place very poor legislation. I was here, I saw it, I voted against it, I was gagged. The Albanese government pledged to reform our national environmental laws prior to the last election, and the Environment Minister stated in December 2022 that legislation will be released as an exposure draft prior to being introduced into the Parliament before the end of 2023. But here we are, June 2024, and still no legislation in sight. Well, it's now, so we really are staring down the effect that we're going to go to the next election with a broken promise that we will not have strengthened environmental laws. So on the one hand, the government talks about biodiversity crisis, but on the other hand, we're here 2 years later with not enough action. So whilst the bills before us do represent a step in the right direction, they need improving, and it has been disappointing that whilst the Minister, and I thank her and her team for their engagement, they have simply not been prepared to consider amendments that have the backing of environmental groups to better this legislation. Small changes include that the State of the Environment report will be every 2 years rather than the current 5-yearly pattern. That's good. The establishment of Environmental Protection Australia is a true first, alongside the establishment of Environmental Information Australia. I support these changes, but without better powers and clear objects, it will make little difference because this EPA will ultimately be applying the currently flawed EPBC Act standards. And while the agencies will be tasked with measuring our progress towards becoming nature positive, I note that this is not even defined in this bill, and the efforts of my crossbench colleague, the member for Goldstein, to actually define what nature positive means have not been accepted. This concept is adopted readily internationally and boils down to this: halting biodiversity decline by 2030 against the 2020 baseline and achieve recovery by 2050. I'm a bit ironic about the 2020 baseline because I think we've got a decline of biodiversity that's occurred quite some time before 2020. Unfortunately, the government is proposing to embed a less than satisfactory version of nature positive without a clear definition, target dates or baselines, real baselines, to work from. Increased access to relevant and timely data means governments, companies and NGOs can better understand and report on how well our environment is being managed. Better information is critical. It prevents inappropriate projects that should not be even proposed in the first place. These bills also mandate the production of a comprehensive and ongoing national environmental economic accounts by law. It will mean we can track the health and environmental assets at different scales from the habitat of a single threatened species to the entire continent. The Transition Bill amends the EPBC Act to increase criminal and civil penalties and add new compliance and enforcement powers, and penalties will be increased for lawbreakers to up to $780 million in some instances. This is good, but it's too soon to say whether a new agency will be a tough cop on the beat without the wider overhaul of the environmental laws. And unfortunately what we have is trust me, it's coming, but the reality is it should already be here. There is an appalling track record for monitoring biodiversity in Australia. The National Audit Office in 2022 found that management of threatened species concluded there was little evidence the desired outcomes of our environmental laws were being achieved due to the department's lack of monitoring, reporting and support for implementation of conservation advice, recovery plans and threat abatement plans. So it's clear we have decisions being made, and I want to highlight this, that despite multiple provisions in the transitional bill transferring power from the Minister to the CEO of the EPA through the EPBC Act, the government has fallen short of providing the EPA with the power to assess and give approvals and to vary, revoke or suspend approvals. This is something I would like to see. We urgently need the EPA to be given these powers. Beetaloo and the failure of the Minister to use the water trigger to call that project in is a case in point. Beetaloo is a climate bomb. It's a fossil fuel project with risk to water resource from both contamination and over-extraction. But it has not been referred to the Minister under the EPBC Act using that water trigger. And we have called, we have written, we have requested for that to happen, and it isn't. And that is why a delegated role to the EPA to do this would take the politics out of it so that what needs to be done can happen. These bills can be improved. With others on the crossbench, we've sought to engage constructively with the Minister on amendments of the bills before us. That engagement has been disappointing because there's a complete refusal to hear from groups to improve this legislation based on key areas that key public interest groups have identified as shortcomings in the legislation. And I will be moving these amendments at consideration in detail and speaking to them in detail. Without some amendments, I simply will not be able to support this legislation. We have a high-stakes roadmap and how we implement it. Where to from here? We know time is ticking. The government must bring forward Tranche 3 reforms. Along with many other colleagues, I've written to the Minister on a number of occasions asking to implement the full range of nature-positive reforms and the overhaul of the EPBC Act that is needed. We're yet to see that. So I share the frustration of nearly all environmental and climate groups regarding the delay to these much-needed reforms. As stated in the Samuel Review, its operation as a major flaw for the environmental law. It has little benefit to the environment. So despite lengthy consultation, we are still not seeing the changes, at the very least a draft, an exposure draft, or some indication of where the Minister's going in improving the EPBC Act, tightening environmental protection. We know business needs certainty, for them to know what projects they can go forward with, what the impacts are going to be, what are the measures they need to take into account. We know renewable projects that are critical for Australia's decarbonisation are facing unacceptable delays in assessments and approvals. Reforms, introduction of a priority list, for example, must make it easier for proponents to know not only where it is appropriate to locate a development to avoid impacts to the environment, but also ensure limited resourcing in the EPA is directed towards priority projects. So that is something I will speak to further, hopefully, when we have this Tranche 3 legislation. We must empower the EPA with good, strong, independent powers to make sure independent experts are assessing, approving and enforcing conditions on projects. Too often we see non-compliance with approval conditions come to light, and then we see a watering down of those conditions to keep the project on foot rather than halting the project and actually upholding the environment and protecting it. We don't see a crackdown on the project proponents. So we should have that conditions cannot be watered down, particularly in the events of non-compliance. When conditions related to offsets, we must ensure that those offsets are like for like, that offsets must be secured before the actions commences and that offsets survives in perpetuity. I must disagree with the Minister that the safeguard mechanism sufficiently addresses impacts of emissions and climate on the environment. The government is on notice that methane is not adequately being measured, so every gas project approval under the EPBC Act is not properly being offset when it comes to the impact on the environment. So it is From my point of view, these legislations, whilst I welcome the implementation of an EPA, I'm very aware these bills will return amended from the Senate. I urge the government to consider sensible amendments to strengthen protection.